Thank you very much, P.S. Blackmore. Let me also recognize amidst this morning Mr. Andrew Millett, the acting general manager of Ectel. Also Mr. Bennett Thomas, who is the director of telecoms. Mr. Julius Timothy, who is Dominica's director on the Ectel board. And of course, the other staff of Ectel, and also the representative of the NTRC, who are here this morning. And to you, the members of the media, a very special good morning to you, and those of you listening via the various mediums. Today's ceremony is a very brief one, but a very significant one, because we are witnessing a tangible response by Ectel's board and management to the recovery effort of Dominica following the devastating impact of Hurricane Maria to the infrastructure of Dominica. Ectel, to most persons, is synonymous to telecom regulation, license fees, spectrum management, and universal service matters, among other sector-related functions. However, Ectel encompasses much more than these, as the management team, led by Mr. Millett, was very quick to respond to the telecom restoration efforts in Dominica in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Maria. And they did so by suspending the licenses and the relaxation of regulatory processes in order to expedite overseas of the people's businesses, policymakers, and also to provide necessary frequencies to both Flow and Digicel in an effort to restore communications in Dominica. So we want to thank you for that, for the approval of that, Mr. Millett and your staff. The temporary suspension of these regulatory processes brought hope and a sense of connectivity to communities and people during a time of apparent despair, as telecommunication systems could be quickly restored to facilitate communication by family and friends. And of course, all of us remember the difficulties that we had days after the storm in communicating, and we were able to, in quick time, have some temporary measures implemented to facilitate some sort of communication. Today, Ectel will make a presentation of $350,000 that will be broken down as follows. $150,000 will be made to the government of Dominica to go towards the housing sector, and that will target the communities within the St. Joseph constituency where some housing projects will be undertaken. And I want to thank the Prime Minister for his support in that. An additional $200,000 will go towards the National Telecommunication Regulatory Commission of Dominica, the NTRC, to ensure the complete restoration of the NTRC's business, where they are housed, and also the services that they provide throughout this country. So this is how the $350,000 will be divided. I want to thank publicly the Council of Ministers of Ectel for their approval of these funds, my fellow colleagues, and also the Board of Ectel for moving expeditiously to ensure that this presentation could be made here this morning. As the OECS regulatory arm, may I suggest that Ectel seeks to not only respond with funding gestures such as these after disasters, but to look at ensuring governments strictly adhere to and enforce the provisions of the Temper Convention on Emergency Telecommunications in all jurisdictions in member states, in keeping with the mandate to ensure: 1, reliable, rapid availability of telecommunication resources for disaster mitigation and relief operations; 2, to facilitate international cooperation to mitigate the impact of disasters; and 3, to facilitate the effective, timely deployment of telecommunication resources that rapid, efficient, accurate, and truthful information flows are essential to reducing the loss of life, human suffering, damage to property, and the environment caused by disasters. And this is very critical. I would further recommend that since telecommunication services are so fundamentally critical before, during, and after any natural disaster, that legislation and certain regulations be looked into for the facilitation of a unified and resilient network for use by all subscribers, irrespective of service providers' platform, particularly where two or more competing networks are operational in any member state for the preservation of life, property, and to safeguard the security of the state through adequate and reliable communications. And that simply means in Dominica, we have the two main service providers, Flow and Digicel. And as the minister, I think it is important that during the disaster, these service providers, they are able to share equipment to ensure that if one service provider has their towers up, you as a subscriber, because you are not subscribed to that particular service provider, you won't be denied. But we can quickly move the process forward so that they can utilize the same towers and you can have communication restored to consumers who may not be subscribed to that particular service provider, and that is critical. A harmonized network in the interest of subscribers in the state would be the most prudent thing to do in such a time of disaster. In the same manner that ECTEL establishes criterion for being a licensed telecommunications provider, I believe they should look at the terms of conditions required to be a resilient telecommunications service provider. To obtain a license, as specific conditions ought to be laid down for resiliency in network design and architecture. And that is something that the government of Dominica is seriously looking into. And we've just completed the tender process, and we are hopeful that whichever service provider is selected to continue providing the government of Dominica with telecommunications services, a key component of that would be to provide resiliency for that network, the design, and the architecture. I am not a telecommunications expert, but may I humbly suggest the following as well. All licenses should ensure that networks must have some form of alternate power supply, whether solar, wind, or geothermal, to keep their system operational when the main electric grid has been damaged or compromised by a storm. Access to satellite communication as a gateway to maintaining communication should be feasible in their design. Underground cabling to major network nodes should be mandatory and installed away from major water tributaries where possible. Incentives should be provided to such providers for designing and installing resilient networks, whether in the form of equipment waivers by government or limited free spectrum to facilitate such deployment. When every sector of our vulnerable economies are to think and act resilient, then we are working for the common good of all our citizens. You should be aware of the government of Dominica's call to make Dominica the first world climate resilient country. And as such, ECTEL member states, and indeed Dominica, should endeavor to establish a government-owned and managed emergency telecommunications network for the preservation of the country's security and resiliency for continued communication when the traditional legacy networks are non-operational after a natural disaster, after we saw the experience that we had from Maria. Such a network would not be conceived as a competitor to the local service providers, but simply as a non-billable service for a short interim of time to ensure government services continuity while the legacy networks are being restored to normal service. And looking forward, that's the way that we want to go. I would also like to highlight, very briefly for now, some of the Ministry of Information, Science, Telecommunications and Technology plans for building back and for contributing towards this network. The government of Dominica will procure the necessary equipment that would be required to withstand a disaster and you will utilize this equipment during and after a disaster. And the equipment such as the VSATs, the satellite phones, and others, the government of Dominica will procure these things. Additionally, we want to encourage the ham operators that in every community we have a licensed ham operator, that when the legacy networks have been disrupted or destroyed during a disaster, a licensed ham operator in every community across Dominica can have some level of communication to keep in touch and to find out what is happening. And we have to learn from our mistakes. And that is why the ministry is moving ahead to ensure that we can get these things regularized. Additionally, we will be also presenting a plan in collaboration with the Ministry of Tourism and also the Ministry of Public Works to get the city of Roseau as is functioning as a smart city. And that is very critical, because moving ahead to ensure that we have the level of technology and the level of communication that we need, we have to work towards getting the city of Roseau to become a smart city. And that is in the plan that we have looking ahead and building back Dominica to be a much better place. Finally, let me once again, on behalf of the Ministry of Information, Science, Telecommunications and Technology, and by extension the government of Dominica, say a heartfelt thank you to ECTEL for this generous gesture to the government and people of Dominica, and also to the NTRC. I look forward to continuing to work with ECTEL and to continue to ensure that the service providers and also the consumers here in Dominica can continue to have the services that they require. And just a footnote before I leave, because ECTEL is here, and I've always highlighted it at the Council of Ministers meeting, that ECTEL needs to work speedily in ensuring that the roaming rates, particularly within the OECS territories, is something that is looked at critically to ensure that these rates can be lowered. Because why is it that you have to leave Dominica and go across to St. Lucia or to Antigua or to St. Kitts, and you have to pay so much for roaming charges? It is critical. In such a small area, the EU has gone ahead and done it. Why can't we, 5 countries within the OECS, do the same thing to reduce the roaming rates for our citizens here in the OECS territories? So this is my challenge to ECTEL, and the acting manager is here. And I'm sure he'll take it back, and also the director for Dominica, who sits on the board, Mr. Timothy. So I'm hoping that at the next board meeting that this is discussed, and when the Council of Ministers meet, we can take a firm position on this thing. Thank you very much, and God bless you.